You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and I'm Chevy Lynn Vasky with the K-State Radio Network. K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien begins today's show by discussing the grain market outlook and further details continued strong exports and the international grain market. We continue the show with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth, who addresses concerns about armyworms across crops in Kansas. The show ends with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond as he discusses the upcoming moisture and cooler temperatures in the forecast. That and more is coming up ahead on this episode of Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we begin Friday's show with K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. Daniel, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Daniel, what's the grain market outlook looking like?
At the Risk and Profit Conference this morning, we discussed that, and no doubt concerned about low price prospects. When you look at how we got here with regard to the corn, sorghum, soybeans, and wheat. For the corn, we just had the USDA NASH report that came out on the 12th, measuring conditions on August the 1st. There was a survey of farmers without the USDA being in the field yet. That'll happen September 1. They were very, very optimistic in terms of corn yields. USDA NASH had taken in all their input, had projected a U.S. corn yield of record high of 188.8 bushels per acre. And normally we've been talking about 180, 181, something like that. So this is by far a record high. And following that high yield, the USDA had also raised the corn acreage figure as well by a total of just over 2 million acres planted and almost 2 million harvested. So a combination of higher acres, high prices gave us a corn production figure of about 16.7 billion bushels. And that really is the big number in the corn outlook situation, because with that much supply, and you've got generally, you have a strong leaning towards ending stocks to raise, even with pretty strong usage. And that's what happened also. The USDA, in response to that strong supply figure, raised the amount of corn feeding that they were estimating, the amount of corn used for ethanol, exports, all to strong highs. In fact, the export figure raised to a record high of 2.875 billion bushels. So for those that are familiar with wrestling with corn balance sheets and wondering what they mean, how they work out, that's strong, I guess, signal for usage. And it really kind of plays to the idea that the best cure for low prices is low prices, in that it really spurs on demand. So it's definitely put us into a buyer's market for corn. The ending stocks figure projected at over 2 billion bushels up to 2.117 billion. Stocks to use went from an estimate of just under 11 coming out of the July report to 13.3 now in this August report. So it really raises the issue of how farmers are going to manage this situation. It begs the question, will we end up at those high yields? There's a farmer tour that just happened this week in the middle of the Corn Belt, and generally saw strong yields, but some questions. Would not be surprised out of that we end up still with north of 180 bushels an acre, but more like 184, 185. Again, some rust issues in the Iowa corn crop that are concerned going forward. It wouldn't be surprised that we still have tremendous corn yields in the U.S., but maybe not as high as that first figure out the gate. So that was big, and also looked at sorghum. And of course, that's mainly a Kansas crop, and had seen the acres also jump in that from the July estimate of 6.2 million up to 6.6. So stronger acres also for sorghum, and yields up just slightly higher. Ending stocks for sorghum pretty much unchanged. We did see an increase in the estimate of sorghum to be fed and probably ethanol usage. Anyway, you got both the feed grains having pretty much an oversupply situation. The USDA projected the corn price at $3.90, down 30 from the July estimate, $2.70 for sorghum per bushel. That also down about 30 cents from July. So people at our conference are asking a lot of questions about, well, where do we go from here? Well, we probably wait till the numbers finally shake out in terms of the actual supply-demand balances and then see how filled up buyers are. And we're probably in some type of a storage mode as we go forward. And we'll see. And as we look at soybeans in the August report were down about 2.4 million acres, 2.4, 2.5. A little bit higher yields for soybeans, 1.1 bushel increase up to 53.6, also a record. Lower acres, a little bit higher yield. You ended up with a reduction of a moderate reduction in soybean production, down about 43 million acres. Ending stocks figures, by the time you ran that all the way through the balance sheet, and a little bit lower crush to balance things out, ended up with ending stocks at 290 million, down about 20 from the previous estimates. Stocks to use 6.7%. So not a lot of change there, but a little more friendly on the supply demand balance side for soybeans. And then for wheat, really no major changes for wheat. What's been going on in the wheat market really has been pretty strong exports. We've seen with the wheat harvest just coming in and elevators probably pretty full and not lots of extra storage when they're getting wheat in. They're of the mindset to the market overall, industry overall is on the mindset to go ahead and push through extra wheat into the supply demand chain, to move it on into export. And we've been seeing pretty strong exports for wheat. For hard red, what we grow in Kansas, seeing the estimate of hard red winter wheat exports up 25 million, up to 300 million. It wasn't, but 2 months ago we were at 210. So hard red winter wheat exports going pretty strong. Part of that's, again, more than adequate supplies. The other part is a moderation in the U.S. dollar. So overall, I guess to sum up what we discussed earlier this morning, generally, I don't think anybody's surprised, given the numbers we have right now, that we have pretty docile, I wouldn't say anemic, but pretty docile grain markets. Prices not doing tremendously well. But again, it's September. We'll see how the final numbers come down. Particularly if the corn number softens some, that'll help a bit. But either way, we have large supplies and we'll be in a storage market heading off into the fall and then watching for whatever happens around the globe, mainly down in South America, but in Brazil in particular with regard to plantings and crop size and all of that.
Daniel, what are international grains looking like?
Yes, and of course, we had here at the conference yesterday a couple presentations on international grain market trends. And one thing that's pretty noticeable is that the changes in acreage in some of these countries, and in particular, you see Brazil growing in terms of acreage, but also to see their yield trends. The U.S. on a year-to-year basis still has the strongest year-to-year per acre bushel changes that are occurring, but Brazil isn't far behind. A country like China that would love to grow a lot of grain to meet its export needs is trailing markedly behind, particularly for corn and for soybeans as well. So you see those changes. It seems like when you look at where the mindset of grain buyers are and on the world stage, eroded in the corn and wheat markets is a place where we're at about minimum levels. If we had a major crop shortfall, we've been waiting about 2 or 3 years to change that situation and actually have a shock to the system to where you'd actually see prices move to the higher side. However, that hasn't come for a bit of time, and it looks like right now that when you look around the globe, no major droughts on the horizon, except maybe in the EU. They've got some problems. But other than that, we're kind of at stability. We're at really surprisingly low stocks in the world wheat market. Given how soft wheat prices are, it's still surprising that we're seeing that. And maybe that's some of what's behind this hard red winter wheat export issue. And for corn, also basically sideways to moderately lower. It's not just abundant supplies there either. For soybeans, if anything, on the world soybean side, it's probably because of all the price signals that have been given to the soybean market to grow beans that we're at kind of a level place in terms of stocks use, world stocks use for beans the last 3 years, basically hovering around 30%, no major changes, no major shocks. I just think these are markets that are kind of living myopically. What do I have right in front of me? When we would get to the place where we'd ever have a major drought, then this tightness would be exposed. But until that happens, hey, we'll worry about that tomorrow.
Can you talk what economists are talking about as far as trade tariffs go?
At our best, we're non-partisan, but not everybody is. And you can hear a variety of opinions come out. I think that fair questions to ask with regard to recent trade issues. And questions being asked about whether, according to U.S. trade law, it's legal to impose tariffs on other countries for factors that are other than unfair trade. And that's a reasonable question to ask. There are legal challenges going through the courts with regard to that. The administration isn't waiting for those to be resolved. They're just going forth. The second question, is it reasonable to expect that any of these countries that we're dealing with regard to tariffs will have retaliatory tariffs coming back? And so far, the U.S. has been in a strong enough economic position that none of them have sought to do that. At least I haven't heard of that yet. And probably the biggest long-term question would be whether countries, if they feel coerced by a trading partner, do they take actions to rely on other sources of supply? So what actions do other countries take with regard to their response to tariffs that they might feel are unfair? And there's a question also out there: what is the appropriate tariff rate to have? And there is probably an optimal tariff rate out there. But there's a fair question: is it one tariff rate for every good coming out of a country, or are there instances where you should target certain commodities? So there are things to weigh with regard to that. And I don't bring those up to be political at all, but I've been trying to think in the long run as an economist, and particularly the issue of how do countries diversify trade sources if they perceive that they can get a better deal somewhere else from a country that's putting a tariff on them.
Daniel, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Chevy.
Again, that was K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure. Anytime, Shelby.
Jeff, we've been hearing a little bit about wheat growers concerned with some worms as planting season arises. Can you talk about those?
Some of the worrisome worms for wheat producers going into the fall. We've had serious infestations of two different species of worms. And when I say worms, I'm talking about lep larvae, or the larval stage of just brown noctuid moths. They're kind of nondescript moths, but that's why they're so widespread. The moths are flying around laying eggs, and they lay eggs in batches. The first one I'll talk about is the fall armyworm, and they all have army in the name, and that's because by implication, the eggs are laid in bunches. They move in mass in a bunch, like some folks used to think the armies used to move. But so the first one is the fall armyworm. A little background: they don't overwinter in Kansas. At least they have not in the past. Now, as the weather changes, and they may become so that they can overwinter, but as of right now, they don't overwinter in Kansas. So they fly in, or they're blown in every spring, and they start infesting greenery. They have a wide host range. Will mostly feed on our grasses because that's what's around in the spring. They can affect corn, sorghum, soybeans, wheat, any of the crops that are around, yards. In this past year, we've had some pretty serious infestations in urban areas where they've affected a lot of folks' yards, but they've also been in brome, in pastures, and other areas. So the fall armyworm right now and the true armyworm, as far as the damage is concerned, there's not much difference. As far as the hosts that have the ability to infest, there's really not much difference. So I'll talk about them kind of equally right now, and then I'll split out the difference because one overwinters in Kansas and one doesn't, and that's important going into the wheat planting season. But right now, the fall armyworm or the armyworm, they're pretty much mature larvae, at least the ones I've seen in the last week, which means they're getting ready to pupate. Once they pupate, they'll be down in the soil. That means they're not going to feed anymore, so the feeding's pretty much done. The point is, you can't, if you want to spray them, you're not going to kill the pupae. You got to spray them early on. Remember, timing's all important if you're going to treat any pest at any time. It's all about timing. But the ones I've seen are going to mainly pupate in the next week or two. Now, I don't know about fall armyworm. I don't know if there's going to be another generation in Kansas or not. Nobody does. But I'm hoping when they emerge as pupae into the little dusky moths that they head south for overwintering and they don't become a problem. If not, they may, it's mid to late August, they may lay eggs and produce another generation of larvae. I don't know. It just remains to be seen with the fall armyworm. So there's a potential of having a lot more worms, but really and truly, I've not seen many fall armyworms past mid-September. Like I said, right now we're kind of on that break-even stage where they may pack up and head south, or they may go to other fields and cause problems. The armyworm, the difference in the armyworm is, number one, they overwinter in Kansas. Number two, they're easily distinguished from the fall armyworm as larvae. The fall armyworm, during the larval stage, they have 4 very distinct dots on the last abdominal segment, kind of in a square. They're kind of more of a light gray, dark gray color, but then they have these 4 easily distinguished dots on the last abdominal segment. Whether it's a small larvae or a large larvae, those are easily distinguished versus the armyworm, they don't. The armyworm's usually a little darker black with some stripes on the sides, but they don't have those 4 dots. So, and that makes a difference what's actually feeding out there, because the armyworm, there will be another generation this year. So even though they're pretty much mature larvae, as are the fall armyworms, they're going to pupate, which means no more feeding for a while. And then they're coming out as adult, they're going to mate, and they're going to fly around and lay eggs for 4 or 5 days, and then those eggs are going to hatch, and then those larvae are going to feed for another 30 days. Armyworms, I've seen them as in the larval stage clear up until mid-November, depending upon the weather. I don't know what triggers them to go into overwintering other than just the cold. Once it gets into the mid-20s for, a couple of hours at night, that will put them into the overwintering phase of their development. Now, armyworms, I've seen them overwinter as larvae. I've heard that they can overwinter as pupae and adults also. I don't know that, but they do overwinter as larvae. The importance of that means they're going to feed. They're going to be feeding in whatever is out there that's green, clear up until it gets into the mid-20s. And like I said, some years it doesn't get that cold until December. So how does that play into wheat planting? Well, I don't think the fall armyworm is going to be much of a factor in wheat, even if it's early planted wheat. We always recommend get rid of all the volunteer wheat at least 2 weeks before you plant, and plant as late as possible. This is a perfect example of how that can work. You're not going to have any of these worms in your field, any field, if when the moth comes out of the pupal stage, they don't see any greenery around to lay eggs on. That's what initiates the infestation. The female moth flies around laying eggs on green. So, lower ends of a field that maybe have a little more grass or a little more weedy, a little weedier edge to it, they're going to get the moth's attention. That's where the eggs are going to be. So if you have volunteer wheat, they're going to lay the eggs on the volunteer wheat. If you have wheat, if you've planted and the female moths flying around, they're going to lay their eggs on that wheat. That's why it's important to plant as late as possible. Again, this is another pest, along with some of the others we've talked about previously. But so the armyworm is going to be around, and it's important you look and see which larval species it is, whether it's a fall armyworm. I don't think they're going to be much of a problem in at least a month from now. They should be pretty much heading south for overwintering. The armyworm, they're still going to be a problem. They're going to continue to cycle. We've had 3 or 4 different generations of armyworms in past years, and I don't see that changing. What's going to change that is if we get some cold weather. So it makes a big difference as to which species you are currently worried about, whether it's the fall armyworm or the armyworm. They will both feed on just about anything green. They both kind of prefer grasses, but they will both feed on soybeans or just about anything that's green. That's why when that female moth is flying around laying eggs, if there's nothing green out there, they're going to go to your neighbor's field, or they're going to go to your neighbor's yard that's being irrigated and it's nice and green. That's where they're going to lay the eggs. So just keep that in mind on those two species of worms that are currently, we're currently seeing pretty large infestations, especially throughout central and the southern part of the state. The third worm that's not here yet, but comes in every year, it's one of my favorite insects, despite the fact that it's a pest, is the army cutworm. The army cutworm over summers in the mountains in Colorado. They take off and they head back to the plains states in late August, September, October again, depends on the weather. They mate on their way back, and the female moth lays eggs all the way from, in our case, from Colorado mountains through to the western part of the state. Generally, they get to about maybe 77 highway or 75 highway, which runs north and south through the state. Once you get east of there, there's not much of a problem with army cutworms. So they're pretty much laying their eggs in the western and the central part of the state. So they haven't started doing that yet, but they will. And once they start laying eggs, those eggs will hatch again. But they hatch into really tiny, small larvae. The problem is you're going to have large armyworms and you're going to have these small army cutworms out there feeding, and you need to make sure you can distinguish what the problem is, because the armyworms aren't going to feed in the winter. The army cutworms are.
And Jeff, that's a lot of information. So if somebody's interested in learning more about these pests, are there any resources, or is there a certain place that someone should go to learn more about the pests that they might be experiencing?
Oh, yes, we have lots of resources. Our Crop Insects of Kansas book is a great resource, and I'm not biased about that. And all of our management guides have explanations of how to better manage these things. So you can go to KSU management guide for wheat, sorghum, corn, whichever crop you're worried about, and download it for free. You can go to your local county extension agent, and they will be happy to provide you lots of these resources. But we do have a whole bunch of resources available on these pests and a lot of others, because as wheat planting, gets started and gets going pretty good, we do have other pests other than just these worms that we need to worry about.
Jeff, thank you again for taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure, anytime.
Again, that was Kansas State University's crop entomologist, Jeff Whitworth, as he covered armyworms here in Kansas. I will be sure to link the resources he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more for you shortly. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Chip, what kind of weather did we see in the last week or so?
Well, it's been toasty, to say the least. We've had very warm temperatures across the state, temperatures exceeding the 100-degree mark for portions of southwest and central Kansas. And then thankfully we had a little bit of precipitation to offset that, and that helped mitigate the heat for some folks, especially the Northeast and Flint Hills region. Rainfall over the last week varied by location. It's that time of the year. Still got summer convection around, and thunderstorm activities really limiting the amount of coverage we see in the rainfall. And we end up with heavier rains over very localized areas, up to 2 to even 3 inches of rain in places. Localized, very localized, but most of that fell in the Flint Hills, kind of along the I-70 corridor and into northwest Kansas. It's been good, needed rain for some folks, especially considering the amount of heat that we've seen over the last week with those warmer temperatures. But outside those main heavy rain cores, we saw below average precipitation for a majority of the state. We still average anywhere from about 0.6 of an inch to an inch across the state, depending on where you're at. The lower amounts, obviously, in the western part of the state, they average less rainfall typically. And so when we think about what this does to the drought picture, it didn't do much this week, thanks to the fact that we had some precipitation over the course of the last month, with most folks still running at to slightly below average, but we're starting to build some deficits again. And that's something to keep in mind. And because of that, we saw abnormally dry conditions get added this week into southwest Kansas due to the ongoing dry conditions.
Chip, is there any moisture that we're seeing in the forecast?
Yeah, so we're expecting a pretty substantial pattern change to undergo across the United States. We've got an impressive Hurricane Aaron in the Atlantic Ocean. It was a Category 5 last week. It's obviously since decreased quite a bit, but it also is influencing the pattern. And with a deep low pressure system like that, it breathes basically. These hurricanes they're basically heat engines. They work off the heat of the ocean and then dissipate that heat into the atmosphere, and they basically equalize things out. And when it does that, it develops high pressure around it. So that high pressure is starting to bring moisture in from the Gulf. It's basically rotating counterclockwise into southwestern United States and into the Rocky Mountains, then coming into the plains. And that's being pushed down by a more active jet stream we're getting later in the summer. So we're starting to see that jet stream start to increase in Canada, and it's starting to shift southward. And that jet stream is going to interact with those waves of moisture basically in that high pressure and going to create multiple thunderstorm complexes that are expected for the plains and the Rocky Mountains, starting as early as Sunday night and into Monday. And we're going to see wave after wave after wave potentially next week. That's going to result in some pretty heavy rains, especially for folks in southwest Kansas, where we just added abnormally dry conditions, and south central, where we could see in excess of 3 to 5 inches of rain, especially where those thunderstorms train and tend to hit the same place. It looks like, though, it's going to be a pretty tight gradient. Portions of northeast Kansas might miss out on the rain event altogether, or the multiple rain events, just because of that jet stream so tight, and that is going to result in a very narrow gradient. Additionally, this much precipitation, this much cloud cover, and combined with some cooler Canadian air, we're going to see much below normal temperatures next week, where most folks are going to struggle to get into the middle 70s for highs and low temperatures potentially as low as 50 degrees next week because of that cloud cover and cooler conditions. And that's starting basically Monday and going through the entire week to finish out the month of August. So a substantial 180 when we think about, it's still summertime. Our average temperatures are still upper 80s to mid 60s for lows, and we're going to be much cooler, and hopefully a welcome pattern change to get some moisture, although it's not going to help crops dry out by any means.
Chip, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Again, that was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond with this week's weather update. That's all we have for you this week, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.